this past week I've been Facebook messaging with a friend of mine. She's a church organist and choir director at an Episcopal church down in Lincoln Park. And we worked together 50 years ago when we worked together at Conway Animal Hospital in Southgate. I was a veterinarian and she was a licensed veterinary technician. And 50 years later here, we reconnected a couple years ago, found each other on Facebook. And she and her husband lived down in Flat Rock. So anyhow, I reached out to her this week and I said, hey, I'm sure you're busy, but I want to wish you a blessed, Holy Week. This is the big week of the liturgical Christian calendar coming up here, starting today. Today's Palm Sunday. And she said, busy is the understatement. She's got 4 services, counting today, this next week to handle with choirs and music. And she says, I'll be most happy to get some rest after Easter Sunday. So as much as she loves what she's doing, this week is the week that taxes her the most. So I thought, you know what? This week, I understand that in a different way. This is the week that perplexes me the most. It always has my entire life. From the time as a kid, Holy Week, when people start talking about bodies rising up in the air and souls going somewhere or other and all this craziness going on, and you're drinking the blood and eating the body of Christ. It didn't, as much as I relished in this week and found solace and comfort always in attending services this week, whether as a Lutheran or later on as a Presbyterian, there's still a lot of what the hell is going on here. And from the time that I was in grade school. So I want to kind of refer to a couple things about that and my impressions of how it's affected me over the decades. In fact, there's a story I want to just tell you real quick. When one of our members here, Charonavant Georgia Lewis, back in 2007, in November, first weekend in November, she was dying of breast cancer. And her family came in from Pennsylvania to be with her, and my wife, who is a monk, and she and I were with her when she died in Beaumont Hospital. And so anyhow, a few days later, the family asked that we be at her cremation. They just wanted to make sure that, everything went according to Hoyle, that she indeed was cremated and her ashes handled properly, and, nothing untoward was behind it all. So my wife and I went out. It was a late night that they finally got to Charonavant's body, and they cremate all day and night long, depending on how many bodies there are. And so we got out there late. It was dark, and we're talking with the fella in charge, and Charonavant was in the furnace, and I said, I suppose you're probably gonna be cremated too when it's your time. And he says, are you kidding me? He says, I'm gonna be buried. And I said, how come? He said, just in case at the end of time there's a final resurrection, I want to be in on it. And he was serious. So each to their own. But that was his take on it. He said, there's no way I'm going to be cremated. So I've got to start out with a reading here. If you'll put your hands in Hap Chum, please. This is from the Anagatura Nikaya, the Kalama Sutta. There are some contemplatives and Brahmins, venerable sir, who visit Kesamudha. They expound and explain their own doctrines. The doctrines of others they despise, they revile, they pull to pieces. Some other contemplatives and Brahmins too, venerable sir, come to Kesamudha. They also expound and explain only their own doctrines. The doctrines of others they despise, they revile, they pull to pieces. Venerable sir, there is doubt. There is uncertainty in us concerning them. Which of these reverend contemplatives and Brahmins are speaking the truth, and which of them are telling lies? The Buddha goes on. So, Kalamas, don't go by reports, don't go by legends or by traditions, by scripture or by logical conjecture, by inference or by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, or by probability, or even by thought that this contemplative is our teacher. Therefore, we believe what they say. When you know for yourselves that these qualities are skillful, these qualities are blameless, these qualities are praised by the wise, these qualities, when undertaken and carried out, lead to welfare, lead to happiness, then you should enter and remain in them. End of the reading. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a 1930 movie called Freaks. Have you seen it? Yeah, it's quite a disturbing movie. It's classified as a horror movie. I've seen it a number of times, and I still kind of get the willies when I see it.
I never want to see it again.
Yeah, I understand that. It's about a traveling circus, and the actors in it, the main characters, are all freaks. They're all people with physical disabilities, whether they have only half a body, whether they have no arms and legs whatsoever, and they roll around and yet can light a cigarette with nothing. The woman who has hair all over her body. I mean, you go on and on down the list, and it was made by physical with will disabilities. And the amazing thing about the story at the end of the movie, you wonder truly, who are the freaks and who are the average normal people? Because the freaks come together unified as one to save one of their own from a normal person who disdains all of them and is trying to kill one of them, or actually to steal a whole bunch of money from them. And there's some morals to be learned, but truly, like Greg says, it's a disturbing movie and not something you want to watch too many times. So I say that because when I was growing up, one of the things that my folks like to do, and I'm not sure of the validity of their reasons, although they certainly never talked about any of these types of sideshow characters in any bad way. We used to go to a lot of the sideshows and see the person who doesn't have any legs or has an alligator face or whatever. And quite routinely, actually, when there was a circus around. And we went one time to, I don't think my sister was with us, it was my mom and my dad and myself, to a sideshow. And there's mirrors set up there. So, it's a trick, but I'm like, 10 years old at the time, so I'm taken in. And here's a body, a man, sitting in a chair, and where his head should be, there's just a metal rim, and there are 3 metal tubes that go down into his neck. And they tell the person to move, and the person moves, but the head doesn't move. And, I move around the room. There's only so far you can move because of these mirrors, but I'm like, damn, what is going on there? I mean, I was just taken in. And, I was fascinated by things scientific, especially biological and chemical. And I was fascinated by religion and the idea of what the hell is this thing that the church calls the soul. And so my uncle, my dad's brother, was a medical doctor. And I think it was about a week or two later, he was over at our house, and I explained to him, I said, is it a possibility? And he was being kind to me, and he said, well, he said, I'd have to see it myself. I'd have to check it out for myself, But he said, is it a possibility? Maybe. Maybe it's a possibility. But he said, for the most part, you need a brain and you need nervous wiring to go to the rest of the body for this to happen. So I've always been fascinated by this idea of body and soul, and how do they work together? Do they work together at the end of time? Is there a soul that goes on? As Christianity says, and Islam says, and Hinduism says, that, gets reborn somehow or other in another body, just the way it was? Or does it just kind of burn up or get buried with the body? Is the body done? I've always been fascinated by that. And it's part of the reason why I became a veterinarian and then later went into studying theology. And I'm here now. So, when I was in 10th grade, our teacher, our English teacher, his name was Mr. Bullion, and he was a real suave guy. Some people say suave. He was a real suave. He had black hair that he parted and slicked back and wet down, and so it slicked back really nice. He had black horn-rimmed glasses. He smoked a pipe. He drove a 2-seater sports car. And he loved jazz music. And I was in advanced placement English. And so he liked to challenge us. The odd thing about Mr. Bullion, and when he was in his later 30s, he got married to one of his students, a beautiful young 18-year-old, and was still married. And so anyhow, that was his wife, and he was known throughout the whole school as this suave guy who has this young, beautiful wife. So he gave us an assignment one day. He wanted us to practice. Most of us were hopefully college bound, and he wanted us to practice writing a paper, a 5-page paper, and we had to do research, and we had to have footnotes, and we had to have a big bibliography. So I knew what I was going to do. I was going to study what I could about Plato and his idea of the soul. So I went over to the Dearborn Library. At the time, it was, other than the Detroit Public Library, it was the most best stocked library there was in the Metro Detroit area. And I spent a Saturday over there researching Plato and his idea of the soul. And did I come to any final conclusions? No, I just learned a little bit more about Plato. And he has this world of forms where everything is already pre-existent. Souls are already pre-existent in the world of form, and they're just waiting for a body to come along to inhabit. And then down the road, that body will die, and then it goes back to the world of form, and it's born again and again and again. It's called transmigration. And some of the early church fathers back in the 200s and 300s actually believed in that too. They were later kicked out of the church and called it heretical, but they believed in that, Origen being the main one. And he believed that there are 3 parts to the soul. There's the body, but then the soul, there's the rational part, which is obviously the head and the brain. And then there's the spiritual part, which is this area right here. And that part actually lived right there. And of course, we have the heart right there. And then there's the part that is the area of desire, be it gustatory or sexual or whatever, right around the navel there. And, I didn't really get into that breaking up of the soul in the 3 different parts, but just the idea that there's a soul when you die, the body dies, that keeps going, intrigued me. And so, much of my study of theology and working towards becoming a church pastor, this is what's behind that. Try and help other people as we try and find out what this life and this death is all about. Well, this type of thinking led me to something called homeopathy. Anyone ever heard of homeopathy? Okay, so I started going out of state and studying with medical doctors. Homeopathy, go for long weekends, and found it fascinating because I thought, this is bullshit. There's no way this can happen. Allopathic medicine is the way to go. Allopathic medicine, the opposite of disease. If you have diarrhea, you give an anti-diarrheal. If you're vomiting, you give an if you have a temperature, you give something that brings the temperature down, Tylenol, whatever. And homeopathy says just the opposite. If you have diarrhea, you give something that in coarse form would cause diarrhea, but it's been diluted out hundreds or even thousands of times. And like cures like. And when I first heard that, I said, how can this be? And so I contacted the veterinarian in Baltimore, Maryland, who was the head of our veterinary homeopathic society. And he said, here's what I want you to start reading. Here's what I want you to start trying. And it's like, how can this work? For instance, I brought this bottle out here. This is just one of hundreds of homeopathic remedies that I have in different strengths. But this is Pulex irritans. This is the human flea. Okay, the human fleas go back like close to almost 600 million years. In fact, they found a Pulex irritans, probably from this species of flea and genus from a tree sap from over in the Far East, millions of years ago. And so what is done with this is, in preparing it, is we got all these tiny little sugar pellets in here that are about a quarter of the size of a BB, maybe even a fifth of the size of a BB. And human fleas or animal fleas or whatever, this just happens to be human fleas, are ground up and soaked in alcohol for a certain amount of time. And the energy of this animal is sucked into the alcohol. It's filtered. 1 drop of that alcohol is placed in 100 drops of distilled water. 1 drop of that is placed in 100 drops of distilled water. Down and down and down 30 times. This is a 30C distillation. It's impossible for there to be a single molecule of flea left in here, and yet the more you dilute it, the stronger it becomes. And like I said, initially I said bullshit. It's against logic. It's against anything rational. And once I started using it, I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. Because what I would use this for is, I'm sure a lot of you have dogs and cats that have been allergic to those fleas that are crawling around on them. And there are 2,500 species of fleas, so dog and cat fleas and human fleas can be on all of these different things, but human fleas tend to go to pigs and people. Those are the two that they really like. So I use that in, have people give that. They come in with flea allergy rather than giving them antihistamines or heavy doses of steroids. I'd give them this and say, try it. And after a few days, they call up and they say, I'll be damned. It's working. And I used it on people who didn't know a darn thing about homeopathy. I'd say, you trust me, don't you? And they'd say, yeah. I said, let's try it. If it doesn't work, we'll go to steroids and antihistamines, all the other jazz that's used. But I said, let's try this. And it was fascinating. And it started working more and more. And then I'd use other remedies on other conditions. And I couldn't believe, not that it worked on every case by any means, but it worked on probably at least 70-75% of the cases. And it's like, okay, I've got to learn to accept that our universe works differently than I've been told, and how we heal works differently than how I've been told. And so homeopathy, the thinking is that each of us is 3 parts. The outer part is all physical. The next part in is mental and emotional, and our inner core, the most important, is spiritual, spirit. And the more outer a disorder is, skin allergies, diarrhea, whatever, it's remedied pretty darn quickly. When you get to the mental and emotional, it's not remedied so quickly because it's deeper seated within our being. And you get to the spiritual, and it's really tough to address. But that's where my focus has always been, and why, one of the reasons why. because you heal the spirit and you can heal so much other of yourself. So, I really don't think it's a coincidence that I finally ended up in Buddha Dharma. Because what does Buddha Dharma do? The historical Buddha's 5 skandhas of human personality. He doesn't talk about soul, remember? Soul is something that Hinduism, the Vedic scriptures talked about. There is a core of our being, and that core goes from body to body, lifetime to lifetime. The same soul, different bodies, just the way Plato talked about, like that. Buddhism says, no soul. There's the body, and there's the mind and the emotional. 4 aspects to it. There's thinking or perceiving. There's feeling. Things are good, bad, or indifferent. There's mental states that develop. We become joyful because of conditions. We become sad. We become happy. We become angry. We become jealous. And we carry those mental states as tendencies within our body, the way we tend to react to every situation we encounter. And then finally there's baseline consciousness. Those are the 5 parts of human personality, of who we are. And that makes sense to me, because the historical Buddha said, you can't have one without the other. They don't exist without the other. You need a body for these mind things to manifest, and you need the mind things need a body to manifest. They work inherently together. You cannot tease any of these things apart. So, the idea of a human personality based on the Buddha's 5 skandhas, or 5 trunks, 5 ways of looking at things, makes sense to me. It's no wonder that I ended up where I did. I want to read you, if you put your hands in Hap Trong, the historical Buddha said this, and it was written down by his disciples after he died. This is verses 153 and 154 in the Dhammapada. So after all of his study and experience, and this is one thing I want to stress, experience. Buddhism, if anything, it's experiential. Far East traditions come from within us. The answers are within us. We don't get them from without. A lot of people like to read all kinds of philosophy and scriptures and whatnot of Buddhism and think that it's all coming from without there. We're just kind of remembering, reconnecting with what's already in here, with what's out there. So you've got to experience it for yourself. So here's what the Buddha finally came to. I have gone through many rounds of births and deaths, looking in vain for the builder of this body. Heavy indeed is birth and death again and again and again. But now I have seen you, house builder, and you shall not build this house again. Its beams are broken, its dome is shattered, self-will is extinguished, nirvana is attained. End of the reading. And I want to make one more comment, because I mentioned Sharonavant, Georgia Lewis, before, and her death and being at her cremation. But my wife and I were also at her death, and we chanted her with a couple different chants into her next becoming. And she was sitting in lotus position, believe it or not. She was a real small, slight woman. I think when she died, she was probably about 85 pounds, and the cancer had really kind of eaten her up. And but she was a dedicated Buddhist for many years. So the family came in. They were out in the hallway. They didn't want to be with her when the passing happened, and which is not uncommon. So we told them that she was gone, and they came in, were sobbing and crying all over the place. And my wife and I took off our robes and we got our grays on after, underneath that. And we went outside, and it had just finished raining. And we hopped in our car and we're driving out of Beaumont Hospital onto 13 Mile Road to come east here, back home. And all of a sudden, there's a rainbow right over Beaumont Hospital, a beautiful rainbow. And wow, look at that, look at that. And it's almost like where Georgia was, where Toronto was in a room. And we just go past Woodward, and we're just driving a block, that first light, whatever it is. And a car pulls out of the side street. And what license plate does it have on it but Georgia? Something goes on when the body dies. I don't know what it is. I don't know the extent of it, but there is something. I call it, an imprint that goes on of what karmic we carried and what karmic debt we carried, and we're carrying it on. Something goes on. That stuff didn't just happen.